Arthur Penhaligon was a man who lived in the margins. A failed novelist and an even worse husband, he spent his days cataloging old newspapers in a basement office. His life felt like a book with half the pages ripped out. One rainy evening in London, Arthur found a door he had never noticed before in the back of a shuttered subway station. The sign above it didn't say exit. It said, "The Archive." Driven by a strange, magnetic pull, Arthur entered. He found himself in a space that defied geometry. Shelves made of dark, polished mahogany stretched miles into the air, disappearing into a golden mist. There were no books. Instead, millions of small, translucent glass jars lined the shelves. Inside each jar, a tiny, glowing flicker of white smoke swirled restlessly. "Welcome, Arthur," a voice rasped. Standing by a massive marble desk was a woman in a charcoal suit. Her eyes were like mirrors. They didn't have pupils. They only reflected whatever was in front of them. "I'm a head curator," she said. "You're late. Your own jar has been vibrating for 30 years. She pointed to a jar labeled Arthur P., the man who stayed. Inside, the smoke was thick and gray. "What is this place?" Arthur whispered, his heart racing. "This is the archive of unfinished lives," the curator explained. "Every time a human makes a major choice, a version of them dies. The version that didn't choose, the what if, comes here. This is the graveyard of the lives you never lived." She picked up a nearby jar labeled Arthur P., the acclaimed poet. Inside, the smoke was a vibrant electric blue. "In this life, you didn't quit the university. You moved to Paris. You were loved. You were brilliant." She leaned in, her mirror eyes cold. "Would you like to taste it? Just a sip of the life you threw away." Arthur knew it was a trap, but the grayness of his own life was a suffocating weight. He reached for the blue jar, but as his fingers touched the glass, he heard a scream, a silent, vibrating shriek that came from inside his own chest. The jars on the shelves began to rattle. "Careful, Arthur," the curator warned, her smile widening. "The unlived are very, very hungry. They've been waiting for a host to carry them back to the surface." Arthur's hand trembled. The blue jar, the life where he was a celebrated poet in Paris, felt warm, almost pulsing with a heartbeat. As he pulled it toward him, the curator's reflection in the glass seemed to ripple with a dark, expectant joy. Suddenly, a violent tremor shook the archive. A shelf nearby groaned under the weight of a million regrets, and the blue jar slipped from Arthur's slick palms. Smash! The glass didn't just break, it detonated. Instead of shards, the air was filled with a blinding, electric blue mist. It didn't dissipate, it lunged. Arthur screamed as the mist forced itself into his mouth, his nose, and the pores of his skin. It felt like drinking liquid starlight in jagged ice. For a moment, his vision fractured. He wasn't in a dark archive anymore. He was standing on a balcony overlooking the Seine, the smell of expensive tobacco and old books filling his lungs. He felt a deep, profound sense of accomplishment. He felt important. "Arthur, are you all right?" The voice snapped him back. He was on the floor of the archive. The curator was looking down at him, her mirror eyes reflecting a version of Arthur that looked 10 years younger and far more handsome. "The seal is broken," she whispered. "The poet has entered the clerk." Arthur stood up, but his legs felt too long. His hands, once calloused from filing papers, were now soft, with the ink-stained fingers of a writer. But the horror began when he looked at his shadow on the marble floor. His shadow wasn't standing still. While Arthur stood paralyzed with fear, his shadow leaned casually against a phantom bookshelf, miming the action of lighting a cigarette. It moved with a grace Arthur never possessed. "What's happening to me?" Arthur gasped. "A what if is a powerful ghost, Arthur," the curator said, beginning to file away the broken glass. "You now have 2 sets of memories, 2 souls fighting for 1 set of bones. If you don't find a way to stabilize the poet, he will consume your current self. He thinks he deserves the sunlight more than you do." Arthur ran for the door, his mind a chaotic storm. He remembered his wife, Sarah, but he also remembered a woman named Monique whom he had never met. He remembered his small apartment, but he also remembered a villa in Provence. As he burst out of the subway station and back into the rainy London night, he realized something terrifying. The rain didn't feel wet on his skin. He looked down at his arm, where the blue mist had entered. His skin was becoming translucent. He could see his own veins, but the blood inside wasn't red. It was a shimmering, electric blue. He wasn't just losing his mind, he was losing his physicality. The archive wanted its debt paid in flesh. Arthur stumbled up the stairs to his flat, his heart hammering in two different rhythms. One was the slow, sluggish beat of the clerk. The other was the frantic, caffeinated pulse of the poet. He fumbled with his keys, but his hands felt clumsy, as if they were wearing invisible gloves. "Sarah," he called out, his voice sounding richer, deeper, and tinted with a slight French accent he didn't know. The woman who walked into the hallway was his wife, but she stopped dead, her hand flying to her throat. She didn't see the balding, tired man who had left for work that morning. She saw a man with thick, dark hair, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that burned with a terrifying, restless intelligence. "Who are you?" she whispered, backing into the kitchen. "How did you get in here? Where is Arthur?" "Sarah, it's me. It's Arthur." He reached for her, but she flinched away, grabbing a steak knife from the counter. "You aren't him," she cried, her voice trembling. "Arthur doesn't look at me like that. He doesn't stand like that. Get out before I call the police." Arthur backed away, catching his reflection in the hallway mirror. He gasped. It wasn't just a change in appearance. His face was a flickering composite. For 1 second, he was himself. The next, he was the poet. The identity leak was becoming a flood. He ran into the bathroom and slammed the door, splashing cold water on his face. When he looked up, the bathroom mirror didn't reflect the room. It reflected the archive. The head curator sat on the edge of his bathtub, though she wasn't physically there. She was a projection in the glass, her mirror eyes reflecting Arthur's own panic back at him. She doesn't recognize the host when the guest is so much more attractive, does she? The curator purred. "The poet is a masterpiece, Arthur. You're just a rough draft. Fix this." Arthur screamed at the glass. "Take him back. Put him back in a jar." "I can't," the curator said, leaning closer until her face filled the mirror. "The archive only takes deposits. It doesn't give refunds, but there is a trade. The archive needs weight to balance the scales. If you want to keep this new, brilliant life, to be the man Sarah could actually love, you must bring me a current soul." "What do you mean?" "Bring me someone whose life is finished. Someone who has no more what-ifs." Or, she smiled, "Bring me someone whose soul is so heavy with love for you that it can't." Replace the void left by the poet. Arthur felt a cold shiver. The curator was looking past him through the bathroom door at Sarah. "Trade her, Arthur," the curator whispered. "Give the archive the woman who loves the clerk, and you can spend eternity being the poet she always deserved." Suddenly, the blue veins in Arthur's arm pulsed. A memory that wasn't his, a memory of the poet writing a masterpiece about the death of love, began to drown out his own feelings for Sarah. He felt a cold, artistic detachment growing in his chest. The apartment was no longer solid. As Arthur stepped out of the bathroom, he saw the world through the poet's eyes, and the poet saw everything as disposable text. The wooden dinner table began to peel away into thin, yellowed parchment. The walls were no longer bricks and mortar, but towering stacks of loose-leaf paper covered in frantic, ink-blurred prose. The very air smelled of graphite and drying glue. "Arthur, why are you just standing there?" Sarah's voice came from the kitchen, but it sounded thin, like a recording played from a distance. Arthur looked at her. To his horror, Sarah was fading. Her skin was becoming white as bond paper, and her veins were turning into delicate lines of handwritten script. She wasn't a person anymore. She was becoming a character. "I have to fix the ending," a voice muttered. It wasn't Arthur's voice, but it came from his own throat. The poet was taking over the narrative. Arthur's right hand moved independently, his fingers twitching as if holding an invisible pen. He watched, paralyzed, as his hand sketched a line in the air. Wherever his fingers moved, reality followed. He erased the kitchen door, and it vanished into a cloud of white pulp. "Stop it!" Arthur screamed internally. "She's not a story. She is a subplot." "Arthur," the curator's voice echoed from the paper walls. "And subplots must be pruned for the masterpiece to live." Arthur realized that the poet was rewriting his life to match the acclaimed timeline. In that timeline, the poet was a tragic, solitary figure. There was no room for Sarah. If the poet finished the chapter, Sarah would be filed away in the archive forever. But then, Arthur felt a spark of resistance. He remembered something from his real, boring life. A memory the archive hadn't touched because it was too small, too insignificant for the curator to value. He remembered a wooden toy box his father had given him. It had a secret compartment. In his childhood, he had imagined it was a librarian's key. He hadn't thought of it in 30 years. The key. Arthur gasped, fighting for control of his lungs. He lunged for the hallway, where his old childhood trunk sat. The poet tried to turn the floor into liquid ink to drown him. But Arthur focused on the weight of the wood, the smell of the pine, the truth of the object. He reached the trunk. His hand, glowing bright blue, fought him, trying to claw his own eyes out. But Arthur forced his fingers into the secret latch. Inside was a small, rusted iron key. It didn't look like much, but as he touched it, the paper walls stopped vibrating. The key represented his core identity, the child who existed before the what-if started. "You found it," a voice whispered. Arthur turned. Standing in the middle of the paper kitchen was a small boy. It was a version of Arthur from the archive. Arthur P., the child who dreamed. The boy pointed to the key. "The key doesn't open a door, Arthur. It unlocks the author. But you have to choose whose hand holds the pen." Suddenly, the poet's influence surged. Arthur's vision went black as his body was jerked upward like a puppet. The poet was tired of drafting. He was ready for the final edit. The floor of the apartment didn't just collapse. It dissolved into a river of jet black ink. Arthur plummeted, falling through a void of swirling letters and punctuation marks until he slammed onto a giant, circular platform. It was a printing press the size of a cathedral. Above him, the gears groaned with a rhythmic thud-thud-thud, like a mechanical heartbeat. Standing across from him was the poet. He was no longer a flicker of blue smoke. He was a solid, towering version of Arthur, wearing a tailored charcoal coat, his eyes burning with an arrogant, cold fire. "You are a smudge on the page. Clerk," the poet sneered, his voice echoing through the chamber. "A waste of potential. Give me the key, and I will make our name immortal." The poet waved his hand, and the ink on the floor rose like a tidal wave, forming into sharp, needle-like quills. They flew at Arthur. Arthur dove behind a stack of giant archive ledgers. He felt the sting of the ink as a quill grazed his shoulder. Where it touched, the skin didn't bleed. It turned into a list of failures. Words like promoted, passed, over, and unfinished novel began to scroll across his arm in jagged script. "The archive feeds on the best versions of us," the poet laughed. "It wants a gold. It doesn't want your gray, pathetic life." Arthur looked at the librarian's key in his hand. It was vibrating. He realized the poet's weakness. The poet was a perfectionist. He existed because he was acclaimed. He was a masterpiece. Masterpieces can be ruined, Arthur thought. He stood up, exposing himself. "You want immortality? You want the perfect story?" Arthur shouted. "Then you'll have to take the true ending." Arthur didn't attack the poet. Instead, he turned the key toward himself. He didn't focus on the Parisian balconies or the applause. He reached deep into his mind and pulled out his most shameful, boring, and painful memories. The time he forgot Sarah's birthday, the day he was fired from the bookstore, the nights he sat in the dark, too tired to even cry. He injected these memories into the key and slammed the key into the ink-covered floor. The effect was instantaneous. The pure ink of the poet's world began to clot. The elegant script on the walls was suddenly crossed out by messy, red corrections. The cathedral of paper began to smell like a damp basement. "What are you doing?" the poet screamed, his handsome face beginning to sag, his expensive coat turning into a threadbare cardigan. "You're staining the narrative. I'm making it real." Arthur grunted, his own face returning to its tired, lined state. The poet began to cough, spitting out thick black ink. He was becoming unmarketable. The archive didn't want a poet who failed. It didn't want a what-if that was just as miserable as the current. But the head curator appeared in the air above them, her mirror eyes flashing with anger. "You are destroying the inventory," she shrieked. "If the poet is ruined, the archive has no use for either of you. You will both be sent to the reject pile." The giant printing press began to accelerate, the massive iron plate descending to crush Arthur and the poet into a single, flat sheet of blank paper. The weight of the printing press never landed. Instead, the floor vanished, and Arthur fell into a suffocating, soundless void. He hit a surface that felt like a mountain of wet, rotting cardboard. When he opened his eyes, he was in the reject pile. It was a vast, subterranean landfill of gray paper and shattered glass. Above him, miles away, a tiny pinprick of golden light marked the archive. Here, there were no shelves and no curator. There was only the static. You idiot," a voice rasped. Arthur turned to see the poet. He was no longer the handsome genius of Paris. He was a tattered, ink-smudged wreck, his legs dissolving into a puddle of black liquid. His face was a blur of half-finished features, like a sketch left out in the rain. "You ruined the masterpiece," the poet hissed, his voice bubbling. "Now we're both just garbage." Suddenly, the piles of paper around them began to move. Out of the shadows crawled the rejects. They were figures made of tangled sentences and blurred photographs. People who had tried to merge with too many what-ifs and lost their shape entirely. One had 100 eyes made of newspaper clippings. Another was just a screaming mouth made of discarded letters. "They smell current blood," the poet whispered, a flicker of his old cunning returning to his eyes. "They want your skin, Arthur. They want to be real again." The rejects swarmed, their paper-thin hands scratching at Arthur's coat. Arthur swung the librarian's key, the iron glowing with a faint, stubborn light. Every time the key struck a reject, the creature dissolved into a shower of punctuation marks. "We have to climb," Arthur said, grabbing the poet by his threadbare collar. The pillars of the archive, they go all the way down. They began to scramble up a massive, circular pillar made of millions of stacked ledgers. The climb was grueling. Arthur's muscles ached, but the poet was becoming lighter and more dangerous. "You know," the poet whispered as they climbed, "only one of us needs to reach the top. If I merge with you now, while you're exhausted, I can use your physical weight as a tether. I can climb you like a ladder." Arthur felt a cold hand on his spine. The poet wasn't trying to help. He was waiting for Arthur to reach the threshold of the real world so he could hijack his body at the last second. "Look up," the poet suddenly cried. Above them, a giant mechanical claw, the decataloger, was descending from the mist. It was sweeping the reject pile, picking up waste to be shredded. "If that claw catches us, we're erased." Arthur reached for a ledge, but his hand slipped on a slick patch of ink. He began to fall. The poet reached out, not to catch Arthur's hand, but to grab the librarian's key. The poet's fingers closed around the iron handle of the librarian's key with a strength born of pure desperation. As Arthur tumbled backward, his heart leaping into his throat, the poet didn't look down with pity. He looked down with the cold, calculating eye of a writer killing off a character that no longer served plot. "You were always just the first draft, Arthur," the poet spat. The poet slammed the key into the side of the ledger pillar. The iron glowed a violent, neon blue. Suddenly, the ledgers beneath Arthur's feet began to rearrange themselves. The sturdy shelf he was clinging to turned into liquid ink, pouring down into the abyss. Arthur screamed, his fingers clawing at the shifting paper, until he caught a jagged outcropping of unfinished sentences. He hung there, suspended over the lightless reject pile, while above him, the poet began to ascend with supernatural speed, editing the pillar into a smooth, easy staircase as he went. "Don't bother holding on." The poet's voice drifted down. "That ledge is made of your worst regrets. It won't hold the weight of a man." The ledge began to groan. Arthur looked down and saw the paper beneath his fingernails change. The words "I should have stayed" and "I am not enough" started to bleed black ink. As the ledge crumbled, a figure materialized out of the gray fog, standing on the empty air in front of Arthur. It was Arthur, but not the poet. It was a version of him that was hunched, its skin the color of wet ash, its eyes twin pits of black tar. This was the censor, the personification of Arthur's own self-loathing. "Why climb?" the censor asked, its voice sounding like the heavy thud of a closing book. "The poet is right. He is the version the world wants. You are the mistake. If you let go, the falling will finally be over." The censor leaned in, its breath smelling of stagnant ink. It began to peel Arthur's fingers away from the ledge, one by one. "Give up your physical weight. Give it to the poet. At least part of you will live in the light." Arthur's vision blurred. The physical weight in his chest, the thing that made him human, felt like a leaden anchor pulling him toward the abyss. He felt the temptation to let go, to vanish into the static and let the better Arthur take over. But then he saw a flickering image in the mist. It wasn't a Parisian balcony or a famous stage. It was Sarah. She was sitting at their kitchen table, holding a cold cup of tea, looking at the empty chair where Arthur used to sit. She wasn't crying for a poet. She was crying for the man who forgot her birthday, but always remembered how she liked her toast. "I am more than my mistakes," Arthur hissed, his voice cracking. He didn't try to push the censor away. Instead, he embraced it. He pulled the ashen figure toward his chest, absorbing the self-loathing, the failures, and the gray weight. "I own this," Arthur roared. The weight didn't pull him down. It became traction. By accepting his own brokenness, he became too heavy for the reject pile to hold. The ledgers beneath him solidified, turning into iron-hard stone. Arthur began to climb, not with the grace of a poet, but with the brutal, grinding persistence of a man who refused to be erased. Above him, the poet reached the threshold of the archive, his hands stretching toward the golden light. But Arthur was gaining. He wasn't using a staircase. He was tearing his way through the narrative with his bare, ink-stained hands. Arthur breached the floor of the archive like a man climbing out of grave. The golden mist was no longer calm. It was whipping into a frenzy, a literary cyclone triggered by the poet's attempt to force his way back into reality using the librarian's key. At the center of the storm, the head curator stood atop her marble desk, her mirror eyes cracked and bleeding ink. "The narrative is breaking," she shrieked. "Two Arthurs cannot inhabit one ending. The archive is purging the timeline." Arthur saw the poet standing before a shimmering rift in the air. Through the rift, he could see his apartment. Sarah was there, but she was frozen, her body covered in fine, black lines of text. The poet was turning the key in the air, his face twisted in a mask of ego. "Almost done," the poet gasped. "I'm rewriting her heart, Arthur. I'm making her remember the poet. I'm erasing the clerk." "No." Arthur lunged, tackling the poet just as the key turned the final degree. The explosion of energy threw them both across the marble floor. The archive began to groan, the massive mahogany shelves tilting and spilling millions of glass jars. The unlived lives were shattering, filling the air with a deafening roar of a billion voices screaming, "What if?" Arthur pinned the poet down. "You can't have her. She's not a character in your book. I'm the better version," the poet screamed, his skin now a flickering static of blue and black. "Without me, you're just a man who waits to die. Let me go, and I'll give you a masterpiece." Arthur looked at the rift. It was closing. If he jumped through now, he might reclaim his life, but the poet was tethered to him like a parasite. If Arthur went back, the poet went too, and the identity leak would eventually kill Sarah or turn her into paper. The head curator descended, her voice cold as the void. "The archive requires a full stop, Arthur. One of you must stay to hold the shelves together. One of you must become the permanent record." Arthur looked at the key, lying on the floor between them. He realized the only way to save Sarah was to ensure the poet never reached her. And to do that, Arthur had to stay and lock the door from the inside. "I choose the ending," Arthur whispered. He didn't grab the key to go home. He grabbed the poet's throat and dragged him toward the reject pile pit. "What are you doing?" the poet shrieked. "I'm taking us out of the draft," Arthur said. With a final, desperate shove, Arthur hurled the poet back into the abyss. But as the poet fell, he reached out, his ink-stained fingers snagging Arthur's sleeve. Arthur didn't fight it. He let himself be pulled toward the edge. He looked through the rift one last time. He saw Sarah blink. The text lines on her skin faded. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes searching for something she couldn't quite remember. "Goodbye, Sarah," Arthur mouthed. He snapped the librarian's key in half. The rift slammed shut. The archive went silent. Arthur did not fall into the abyss, nor did he die. He became data. When he snapped the key, the archive recognized a final edit. His physical body dissolved into a million microscopic flecks of ash, which were immediately absorbed into the mahogany grain of the shelves. Arthur was now the living index. He didn't have eyes, yet he saw everything. He didn't have a heart, yet he felt the thrum of every what-if vibrating in the glass jars. He was the silence between the words. For what felt like decades, though time in the archive is merely a suggestion, Arthur performed his duty. He organized the regrets of others. He calmed the rattling jars of those who dreamed too loudly. He became a perfect librarian because he had no what-ifs left. He was a closed book. But one day, a jar appeared on the new arrival's shelf that shouldn't have been there. It was labeled Sarah P., the woman who remembered. Arthur's consciousness recoiled. Inside the jar, the smoke wasn't white or blue. It was a warm, sunset orange. It pulsed with the rhythm of a name. Arthur. 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 He reached out with his phantom senses and entered the jar. He saw Sarah's life after the rift had closed. In the real world, Arthur had vanished. The police found no trace of him. Sarah had lived years in a quiet, grieving fog, but she had moved on. She had spent her life at that same kitchen table, writing. She wasn't writing stories. She was writing letters to the void. To the man who wasn't a poet, one letter read. To the man who was just Arthur. "I don't want a masterpiece. I want the man who burnt the toast." Arthur realized with a jolt of terror and hope that Sarah's grief was so concentrated, so pure, that she was drafting him back into existence. By refusing to forget the boring Arthur, she was creating a what-if where he had never left. The archive began to shake. The head curator appeared, her mirror eyes now completely shattered, falling like glass rain. "This is impossible," she hissed. "A current soul cannot dream of a reject. It creates a temporal paradox. The archive cannot contain a memory that refuses to become a record." The orange smoke from Sarah's jar began to leak out, dissolving the mahogany shelves. It was a counter-narrative. Sarah was rewriting the archive from the outside. "Arthur," the curator screamed. "Stop her. If she remembers you any harder, the archive will invert. Everything we've cataloged will be released into the world as pure, unfiltered chaos." Arthur looked at the sunset orange smoke. He could feel his fingers forming again. He could feel the weight of his boring life returning. But he also saw the billions of other jars. If he went back to her, the archive would break, and the reject pile would flood the world. He had to make a choice. Stay as the librarian and keep the world safe, or allow Sarah's love to destroy the archive and bring him home. The archive was no longer a library. It was an open wound. The sunset orange smoke of Sarah's memory acted like an acid, dissolving the permanent records of the head curator. Billions of glass jars shattered at once, releasing a hurricane of white, blue, and gray mist. The what-ifs of every human soul in history were screaming through the halls, looking for an exit. "The seal is gone," the curator wailed, her form flickering like a dying candle. "You've turned the graveyard into a riot." Arthur felt his ribs reforming. His lungs drew in the scent of Sarah's orange-tinted grief, and it felt like fire. He began to run toward the center of the collapsing storm, where a single, glowing door had appeared. The door his wife was literally writing into existence from the other side. But someone blocked his path. It was the poet. He was a hollow, shriveled husk now, crawling out of the ink-stained ruins of the floor. He had no eyes, only two leaking ink wells. He grabbed Arthur's ankle with a grip like a cold vice. "Don't leave me." In the dark, the poet wheezed. "If you go, I am erased forever. Take me with you. We could be the masterpiece together." Arthur looked at the door. It was shrinking. Sarah's energy was fading. She couldn't hold the bridge between worlds forever. He looked at the poet, the version of himself he had always wished he could be. The talented one, the loved one, the one who mattered. "You were never a life, Arthur," the poet cried. "You were just the paper I was supposed to be written on." Arthur knelt down. He looked at the pathetic, ink-smeared creature. He realized that the poet was his own vanity, his own regret, and his own shame. To take the poet back was to bring the archive's poison back to Sarah. "The story isn't about you anymore," Arthur said softly. He didn't kick the poet away. He did something harder. He leaned down and kissed the poet's forehead, a gesture of forgiveness for every time he had hated his own life. The poet let out a long, shuddering sigh and dissolved into a puddle of harmless, silent ink. The better self was finally at peace. Arthur lunged for the door. "Arthur," the curator's voice echoed one last time. "If you step through, you will be mortal. You will grow old, you will fail, and you will eventually die. There are no edits in the real world." "I know," Arthur roared. "That's the best part." He jumped. The epilogue, the real world. Arthur slammed into the floor of his kitchen. The air was thick with the smell of burnt toast and old tea. He was gasping, his chest aching with the weight of a real, pumping heart. His hair was gray, his hands were calloused, and he was undeniably, beautifully ordinary. Sarah stood by the table, a pen clutched in her shaking hand. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a shock that slowly melted into a sob. "Arthur," she whispered. He stood up, his joints creaking. He didn't speak in poetry. He didn't have an electric blue soul. He just walked over and took the pen from her hand, laying it on the table. "I'm home, Sarah," he said, his voice cracking, "and I'm sorry I'm late." In that moment, the archive vanished from his mind. The what-ifs were gone. There was only the now. Across the city, in a shuttered subway station, a small door that had sat in the back for decades quietly disappeared. The wood turned to dust, and the wall became solid brick once more. The archive was closed. The lives were finished. Arthur Penhaligon sat down at his kitchen table and began to eat his cold toast. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted.